Hi, morning. We're going to read chapter 1 and chapter 2 of Patty Reed's Doll this morning. So hopefully you have your book. Um, I know we talked about in class what this story is about. So there's a couple things you can use when we're reading. So the first is there's this map on the front very beginning page, and it shows the route that the Donner Party made, starting in Springfield, Illinois. So they're starting here and they're going to travel through this way all the way to Fort Sutter in California. So as we read about different places, you could always look on that map to see where they are. There's also a picture of the covered wagon, something like that is what they traveled in. Um, and some important rivers and mountains and deserts and things like that. So here is the next page, and it's got an actual picture of Patty Reed's doll. So I told you it was a real doll, and you could see it at Sutter's Fort, which is now in a museum. It's near Sacramento. And then, of course, there's a table of contents. So we're going to try to read 2 chapters every day. I don't know how this upload's going to work with my video, so we'll see how it goes. Chapter 1, Springfield, Illinois, 1846. So this is before the gold rush, right? I am a little wooden doll with a painted face and a knob of painted hair on top of my wooden head. My cheeks are not so rosy as they once were, nor is my hair so glossy black. But is it any wonder? I was a pioneer, and the trials I have been through would change the face of almost any doll. I remember well when first I heard of pioneering and covered wagons, Indians, and wilderness trails. It was in Grandma's big bedroom back in Springfield, Illinois, on the long winter evenings of 1845. We sat in our rocking chairs, Puss and Patty and I, toasting our toes by the warm fire in the grate and coaxing Grandma to tell us her stories. Grandma sat propped up with flouncy pillows in her high four-poster bed, a knitted shawl around her shoulders and her thin gray curls tucked into a white nightcap. She was ailing and frail, for she was very old, but her talk was as lively as ever, and she told the tales we loved to hear about her childhood in Kentucky. For Grandma was a pioneer. She had traveled with her folks over the wilderness trail. Boone's Path, she called it, following the blazed trails or blazed trees that Daniel Boone himself had marked along the narrow, rocky road across the Cumberland Mountains from Virginia to the cane brakes of Kentucky. All sorts of things she told us about pioneering. There were creeks to cross with ugly steep banks, she said. Our hands were blistered from clinging to the tree roots and vines as we clambered up the slopes, and our legs were scratched by briars and thorn bushes. The trail zigzagged up the mountains along narrow ledges, and we could look down through the blue haze and see the green valleys far below. This made us eager to go ahead, for one of those green valleys was to be our new home. At night, we heard the scary cries of wild animals, and always we were on the lookout for the painted faces of Indians peering through the brush. They would creep like bears through the long grass. All of a sudden, arrows would rain from nowhere, but before we could catch sight of the redskins, they had melted into the woods again. We kept right close to the wagons, I can tell you. We didn't fancy the notion of our scalps being tied to some wild Indian's belt. At last, sunburned and leg-weary, we came to the valley where the settlements were. It looked mighty pretty to us, with the trees leafing out and the wind smelling sweet with the wild apple blossoms. Father and the other men took up claims and commenced to clear the land. They worked from sun up to sun down, chopping trees and grubbing out shrubs and bushes so the corn could be planted before summer. Men were hardy in those days, my dears. Their arms were strong and their axes sharp. So that's Grandma, and she's talking about when she was a little girl. She was a pioneer also. Remember, a pioneer is someone who goes and is one of the first to settle a new place. So back in Grandma's childhood, so I don't know how old Grandma is, but this was in 1845. So we could assume it's like 1800, around that time. So that was when America was new and they were expanding west, but they weren't getting as far as California at this part. They were going from like Let's see, where does it say she was going from? She was going from Virginia to Kentucky. So you could look at a map, and not the map in the front because it doesn't have that part of the country, but it could give you an idea kind of westward expansion. I mean, it's still a long trip and still no roads and things like that. So, yeah, I mean, pioneers weren't just in California, right? They're everywhere. Also, California was still part of Mexico at that time in 1800, right? Anyways, Grandma lay back on her pillows, and her dark eyes had a faraway look in them, as though she were back in Kentucky helping her father seed the corn in the fresh plowed furrows of their new clearing. Patty and Puss eagerly begged for more, and Grandma went on to tell of fearsome Indian fights and escapes, of how their neighbors was killed while searching for his plow horse after it strayed into the woods, and how her aunt had been spirited away while she was gathering wild strawberries and kept as a slave for 5 long years in the Indian village away to the north. So they're not talking like they like Indians very much. They're talking about how they were attacked by them, and they were talking about how her neighbors were killed by them, how one of her aunt was captured and treated like a slave. As Grandma related the story, Patty's black eyes grew bigger and blacker than ever. She gripped me tightly in her hand and kept peeping over her shoulder as though the eerie shadows cast by the flames were really lurking savages ready to pounce upon us. So Patty's afraid of Indians. By the time Grandma had finished her tale, we were almost too scared to scamper off to bed. Once there, Patty cuddled me close under the covers, whispering to me not to be afraid, for she would keep me safe from Indians. But I think she was the one who was frightened the most, and it was I who nestled up close, reassured her. After hearing such stories of pioneers and Indians, imagine how we felt to be told that we were to become pioneers. One morning after breakfast, Patty came hurrying up to her room, and, standing before the window seat where her family of dolls was sitting, she breathlessly disclosed the news. Papa says we are going to be pioneers across the plains to California. It will be a healthier place for Mother, and lots of other people are going in the spring with wagons and oxen and everything for keeping house. Isn't it exciting? And you shall all have new outfits for this journey, and a little hair trunk to pack your best clothes in. I'll have my name put on it with nail heads, Patty Reed, and then no wild Indian would dare to steal it, seeing it belongs to me. We only hoped the Indians would understand it that way. As Patty buzzed away to talk it over with Grandma, I tried to explain to the other dolls just how this new piece of news might affect us, for I knew what pioneering was from having heard Grandma's stories. They were not too pleased at the prospect. Rosalie opened her blue eyes wide and complained, "Oh dear, I don't believe I shall like being a pioneer doll. My new velvet cloak and sprigged muslin gown may get mud-stained and dirty. How dreadful to think of leaving this nice clean window seat to travel in a wagon." Minnie, the big wooden doll who was inclined to be of a jealous nature and was always snubbing me because I was only 4 inches tall, remarked acidly, "Pioneering may be fine for you. You're used to being knocked about. After all, you are just a little country cousin." She had heard Patty herself make that last remark, but I knew Patty didn't mean it the way Minnie thought she did. Patty loved me best of all her dolls, and she said I was their little country cousin only because my clothes were not so fine as theirs. Patty herself made them for me, while Grandma sewed their elegant outfits. Patty could not manage her needle quite well enough to do the fine sewing that Grandma did, so while their dresses had beautiful tucks and ruffles and fine feather stitching, my dress was usually a little square with a hole in the head, sewed together with a few awkward stitches, and tied around the middle with a bit of ribbon sash. But I did not envy my sister dolls their elegance. The gentle touch of Patty's fingers as she carefully bent my wooden joints and pulled the new frock over my painted head, and then proudly held me up for Grandma to see, made me very happy because I was her little friend. Besides, she spent more time with me than the others. I was just the right size to ride around in her apron pocket, and thus I came to know much more about the family's doings, and Patty and I shared a secret world all our own. If Patty was going pioneering, I wanted to go too, and I guess the others would feel the same way if it came to a choice between riding in a wagon or being left on some dark closet shelf, as Puss's dolls were. She was 14 and had forgotten her doll family for a long time now. She had a pony named Billy, and we used to look down from our window seat in the yard below and see her ride out the gate with her father. We wondered if the time would come when we, too, would be gathering dust on the closet shelf while Patty rode out with the grown-ups. But that time had not yet come. Patty was only 8, and, so far, she would rather sit and sew at Grandma's bedside, run with messages downstairs to her mother or Eliza in the kitchen, or play with her little brothers, Tommy and Jimmy, always with me in her apron pocket. Yes, if there was any dust to be gathered, I much preferred to gather it out on the trail with Patty than on the shelf of a dark closet. I was present in Patty's apron pocket when the family gathered around Grandma's bed that afternoon to talk over the pioneering venture with her. Mr. and Mrs. Reed, Patty's father and mother, plainly did not think Grandma would be able to go with them, and they gently tried to explain how Uncle Gershom, Grandma's eldest son, and his wife would come to live in the big white house that we should be leaving, and that Grandma would stay right where she was in her comfortable bed, and they would take good care of her. The old lady sat up bright and sudden at the thought of this. "Now you listen here, James Fraser Reed," I heard her say. "You're not taking my daughter Margaret and these grandchildren of mine one step of the way west unless I go along. I guess I know a heap. Sorry, I thought it stopped recording. I guess I know a heap more about Pioneer than you do, and I'm not a fixin' to be left behind." Well, they did a bit more pleading with her, but in the end she got her way. And I must say that I, for one, was glad to know that we were to have so experienced a pioneer as Grandma with us on our dangerous journey through the Indian country. During the next few weeks, I kept my ears open to pick up bits of information to relay to my sister dolls, who were gradually becoming reconciled to the thought of the journey. I told them I had heard Mrs. Reed say there were others from Springfield going west in April. 2 families by the name of Donner, friends of the Reeds, who had several children Patty and Puss's age, and some little ones like Tommy and Jimmy. In their Saturday night reading club, they had been reading a book about California by Mr. Hastings, who said there was so much sunshine that chills and fever and aching bones were unknown. The land was rich and good for several crops a year, and the Americans who were settled out there said there was room for many more. The mothers did not think much of the idea at first, but as the cold Illinois winter dragged on, and Patty's mother had so many headaches and miseries, she was at last persuaded that life would be much better in California. And once she made up her mind to go, the Donner mothers decided to go too. So I'm going to pause here for a minute just to make sure this is working.